City of the Damned. Chapter 1. Arrival. Emma Carter had always considered herself a person who didn't believe in mysticism and superstition. As a journalist, she relied on facts and evidence to expose lies and uncover the truth. But when her editor sent her to the small town of Havensbridge to investigate a series of strange disappearances, she had no idea what she was getting into. Arriving at the old Havensbridge train station on a foggy evening, Emma felt a wave of unease. The town greeted her with silence and cold, as if time had frozen here. The old houses, narrow streets, and dark shadows created the impression that the town had long been abandoned, though lights still glowed in the windows. Her first stop was the home of David Fletcher, a local historian who had promised to help with her investigation. David greeted her with a worried expression and immediately began talking about the strange events that had been happening in the town. He mentioned an old church on the hill and the disappearances that always seemed to occur near it. But there was something else that troubled David even more. Edward Crowe, a mysterious man who had appeared in the town a few years ago. Since his arrival, the disappearances had increased, and many of the locals whispered that Edward was somehow connected to an ancient evil, the stuff of local legends. Emma decided that she needed to meet Edward and find out what role he played in these events. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The next day, Emma went to the old church that David had mentioned. The church stood on top of a hill, surrounded by dense trees, and it looked abandoned and forsaken. When Emma entered, she was struck by a sense of cold and emptiness. The interior of the church was ancient and nearly in ruins. But what caught her attention most were the strange symbols carved into the stone walls, reminiscent of runes. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Edward Crowe. Tall, with a penetrating gaze and a mysterious smile, he looked at her as if he had known she would come. He stepped closer, and his words came as a warning. "You seek things that should remain buried, Miss Carter. Some truths are better left in the past." Despite her inner fear, Emma decided to continue the conversation. She learned that Edward was indeed connected to an ancient cult, but was not a part of it. He was a seeker of secrets, an investigator who had become a victim of the curse tied to this place. He had been trying to find a way to break the cycle of events that had led to so many disappearances, but each time, his attempts had failed. Emma realized that Edward was not an enemy, but an ally who could help her uncover the truth and stop the ancient evil. Chapter 3. Ghosts of the Present. After meeting Edward Crowe and hearing his warnings, Emma returned to her hotel, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That night, she was haunted by nightmares, visions of the missing people pleading for help, their ghosts calling her name and reaching out to drag her into darkness. Waking up in a cold sweat, Emma found that the nightmares had left a mark on reality as well. On her hotel room door, a strange symbol had been drawn, the same one she had seen in the old church. She remembered Sarah Miller telling her about such marks. They appeared on doors before someone disappeared, and no one who had seen this symbol on their door had ever returned. It was a mark of the curse, indicating the next victim. Emma realized that she was now next in line. Her heart pounded with fear, but she knew there was no time for panic. She had to act quickly. She contacted Edward, and they agreed to meet at the church to find a way to stop this ancient force once and for all. Emma felt that her fate was sealed unless she took drastic measures. The meeting with Edward confirmed her worst fears. His face was grim, and he spoke as if they were approaching the end. Edward explained that since her arrival, events had begun to unfold more rapidly, and the dark entity that had held the town in its grip for centuries was now targeting Emma, seeing her as a threat. He also confessed that the marks on the doors were not random. They were a warning that someone was attempting to oppose the evil, and now the entity wanted to eliminate that threat. Emma had become the target not just because she was an outsider, but because she had started uncovering secrets that were meant to stay hidden. Edward knew her life was in danger and realized he might not be able to protect her. But he also knew that there was a way to break the curse, a ritual that could sever the connection between the entity and the living world. But it required a sacrifice. Edward had studied the ritual for a long time and knew that without a sacrifice, the entity would never leave the town. Emma didn't want to accept this outcome, but Edward was resolute. He felt responsible for everything that had happened since his arrival in Havensbridge. He believed he had drawn this evil to the town and now was the only one who could stop it. Emma knew time was running out. They decided to act immediately before the darkness consumed her entirely. And though Emma tried to find another way, she understood that Edward had already made his decision. Chapter 4. The Final Ritual. Emma and Edward returned to the church at night. The fog had once again enveloped the town, and it seemed as if nature itself was against them. Inside the church, it was even colder and darker than during their previous visit. They began searching for the amulet, following the clues from the journal Emma had found. When they finally uncovered the hidden cache beneath the altar, Edward retrieved an old, dust-covered amulet. Emma felt the ancient power sealed within the amulet stir. Edward explained that to destroy the entity, they would need to perform a reverse ritual, a ritual that would send the entity back to where it came from. They began the ritual, reciting the ancient incantations from the journal. As they did, the church began to tremble, and the walls were filled with the cries of the vanished souls. The dark entity, realizing that it was being banished, started to resist, filling the air with malevolent energy. Edward, knowing that time was running out, made his decision. He offered himself as the final sacrifice to break the cycle once and for all. Emma tried to stop him, pleading for another way, but Edward was firm. He knew that if he did not sacrifice himself, the entity would devour Emma and then move on to find new victims. With the last words of the ritual, Edward held the amulet over the altar, and at that moment, when the entity tried to escape, the amulet flared with a brilliant light, filling the church. The darkness dissipated, and Edward vanished along with the entity, freeing the town from the curse forever. When the light faded, Emma found herself alone in the ruined church. She knew the evil had been vanquished, but at the cost of Edward's life. She left the town, knowing she would never return, but she was now certain that the ancient secrets would never claim another victim. The next morning, the town awoke from its long nightmare. The fog had lifted, and the streets of Havensbridge echoed once more with the sounds of life. People began to return to their normal lives, though memories of what had happened lingered in their hearts. Emma returned to her office, but never published the story she had written about Havensbridge. She knew that some secrets were better left untold. Her journal held the records of the ancient cult, the church, and Edward Crowe, but those pages were locked away in the depths of her memory. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.